Technical difficulties over.
Awesome.
All right. All right. Did you share it, Al? Yeah, all good. Okay, he says it's all good. So, we're in the groups and stuff. I imagine on this side of the rock, we're not gonna get too many people tuning in because it's still early over here. But there's a bunch of
Uh,
people over in uh, Australia, New Zealand, of course, over by your way too. You're in
sure.
Japan, Okinawa. Is that where you're at?
Okinawa,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Deep south, deep
yeah.
south of Japan. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, and you work over there, or are you researching right now, or are you teaching? Um,
Yeah, well, I do a bit of both. I mean, I'm mainly research. So I'm
yeah.
interested in kind of modeling, trying to understand the brain, basically using computational and mathematical modeling. That's my kind of day job, what I do,
Yeah,
during the week.
is that like you map each neural function or something to some or try to? Is that kind of what it
Sure.
is?
Yeah, I mean, what I try and do is basically, if you break the brain up into very, very tiny pieces, it's constructed from individual cells called neurons, which
Yeah,
are
yeah,
the fundamental computational processing units of the brain. And each of those neurons is actually a highly complex structure. And what I do is try to kind of peer inside and try to understand how these highly complex networks of molecules inside brain cells actually um, generates the very complex functions of brain cells. So how do the connections between brain cells change over time? When you learn, or for example, and how do brain cells communicate with each other and share information and those kind of things. So I use kind of basically kind of models of these brain cells inside computers and trying to kind of model mathematically and computationally what these brain cells are doing in an effort to kind of understand how they function.
yeah. I could see. Is there like an AI kind of agenda behind that, like trying to figure out how to create it or something like that? Um, like trying to
Is there an
like cybernetics.
Um, ultimately, yeah. I mean, that's possible in the future, but I
Yeah,
mean, the kind of work that I do is very kind of academic level. I mean,
yeah,
certainly
yeah,
the what I'm paid to do anyway. I mean, the psychedelic stuff is kind of on the side, and it's
yeah,
something that I do in my spare time.
yeah,
That is not funded or endorsed by the university where
yeah,
I
yeah.
work.
So you're like
Yeah.
a big fan of McKenna?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, who
Yeah,
isn't, right?
yeah. I like listening
I
to the
mean,
guy.
yeah, since I was a teenager. I mean, this was back in I guess the late 90s. So this was really just when the internet was really in its early days, and only a few people had the internet. It wasn't like ubiquitous. Like certain families would, if they had a little bit of cash, would have would have a modem and they would hooked up the internet. But so finding Terence McKenna lectures, you couldn't find there wasn't YouTube obviously, so you had to find transcripts of his lecture, or you had to go and order his books, basically. So that's what I did when I was kind of 15 years old, was to go to the
Yeah,
local bookshop and say, hey, can you order these books for me? Because they obviously didn't have them in stock. I had to. So that was like True Hallucinations and Food of the Gods, and
yeah.
yeah, and
I
they
got
were
good
my
stuff.
first kind of foray into the world of McKenna, and that's where it kind of all started, I guess.
All right. Well, did that kind of like inspire you to study the brain more?
Yeah, well, it inspired me to study drugs. That's
Yeah,
basically that's been my passion and the kind of the grounding of my entire life since I was a teenager has been an interest in drugs at all levels. And so I started off being interested in the chemistry of these drugs. What is their structure and what are the relationships between them? How are they made? How do they interface with the brain and the body? But to really understand psychedelics, you need to have a very broad scientific education. You need to have training in chemistry to understand the molecules. You need to have training in biochemistry to understand how they interact with receptor sites, for example, protein receptors in the brain, and then you need to understand high-level brain function in order to understand, what these psychedelics actually do when they enter the brain and cause such dramatic changes in consciousness. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is DMT your primary focus on your?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to me that's the ultimate psychedelic in
Yeah.
a way, and it's the one that fascinated me from the beginning. That's what got me excited about drugs was these kind of strange worlds that Terence McKenna was describing. These are death by astonishment, and it's like, wow, that's incredible, and the idea that you can visit this place with such facility, by inhaling a couple of lungfuls of one of the most common plant alkaloids in the world, and yet it instantaneously and reliably transports you to this bizarre alternate alien reality that bears no relationship whatsoever to the normal kind of waking consensus world. That is astonishing, and it's still astonishing, and it still amazes me. And I think we're a little bit closer to kind of getting a handle on what's going on with DMT, but I still think that we're only just really dipping our toes in the water in terms of trying to get a handle on what exactly DMT is, really fundamentally. What is it, and why does it have such profound effects on consciousness, and why does it transport one to these highly characteristic realms that are described throughout the online trip report literature, the DMT space.
I was watching one of your podcasts. I can't remember which one, but you talked about. Oh, it wasn't either that. It was your talk. I think in Denver.
Boulder.
Boulder. Okay, Boulder. Yeah,
Boulder.
yeah, yeah. That's
Nearby,
right. That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
The guy with the
Yeah,
pencil and the
yeah.
apple.
That's right, yeah.
And you explained something, and it was really quite interesting. It was that of course a lot of people know, especially in philosophy and stuff, they know that what we see is not really objective in the fact that our brains are pretty much putting it together.
Mm.
It's
Yes.
it's painting a picture. It's like it's not a photograph like a lot of people
Mm.
think it is. And and then in dreams when there's no function, we kind of hallucinate this little world or create this little world with our brain. And then you were talking about DMT state, and how our brain works. It makes sense that when we dream, we dream about things that we see or, that we know about. But DMT is like completely different. I mean, it's beyond kind of like you can't imagine it, and it doesn't seem like it comes from
Mm-hmm.
anything around here. And that being like a signal, picking up on a signal or something. Could you explain a little bit more about
Yeah.
that, maybe?
Yeah, so as you correctly said, the world you experience is you know, perceiving a world is not a kind of a passive process where the brain kind of receives images or something and then presents them to consciousness in some way. Your brain is actively, from moment to moment, is actively constructing the world. It's a model, basically. Your brain is constructing a model, and it's constantly updating that model based upon really relatively small amounts of sensory information. But that sensory information, so information from the eyes and from the ears, etc., that doesn't actually kind of, in a way, doesn't even enter the brain. The brain is always actively constructing your reality, and then if that model of reality is a good model, if it works, I'm not saying if it's true, but if it works, if it's a functional model that allows you to make decent predictions about behavior, should you run away from that or should you run towards it, for example, simple things like that, then that model is kind of is kept. Otherwise, it is altered and modified. So your brain is actively constructing the world at all times, and it constructs the world using patterns of information, patterns of activity of these billions of neurons of your brain, your cerebral cortex specifically. And so when you dream at night, your brain is doing the same thing. Your brain is very good at it. It's extremely good. It's exquisitely talented, if you like, at constructing a world, and it will do so even when there is no access to sensory data. So when you dream, what's actually happening is there are certain parts of the brain that are responsible for receiving information from the environment, and these are located generally around the back of the brain, and particularly for the visual world. But when you dream, these areas of the brain are actually shut down. So you become disconnected. It's like pulling the wires out, basically, from the environment. And so your brain is completely isolated. And yet it seems completely happy constructing a model of the world, and it does it in exactly the same way. The difference is that the world can become is kind of more fluid and less predictable, and kind of move around a lot because it's not really being guided by information from the environment. But your brain is perfectly happy, and your brain, knows very, very well how to construct this model of reality. Now that is, that's something the brain has learned to do over millions of years of evolution. It's this model of the world that we all experience individually, subjectively, is one that has been sculpted over millions of years of evolution. So the brain, in essence, learned to construct this model of reality that we all experience. Now, when you take a psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin, so what happens is the world changes. It's like you kind of twist the dial slightly out of tune, is one way of putting it. It's a lot more complex than that, but I don't want to get into the neuroscientific technicalities because not really the time or the place. But basically, the model changes slightly. So the world changes. It becomes a lot less stable, a lot less predictable, and becomes much more unstable, unpredictable, and novel and fluid. And there are various reasons why that's the case. But with DMT, something quite different happens, and something quite astonishing, is that imagine twisting that dial a little bit too far. Now, at first, what would happen, of course, is you basically lose the signal, and the brain stops being able to construct any kind of model in reality, and it becomes chaos. But then something startling happens, is that there comes a point when the brain suddenly switches from constructing this normal world to constructing an entirely different, entirely unrelated reality, one that is of crystalline clarity, and that is completely unrelated to anything in the normal world, and that is the DMT space, this bizarre hyperdimensional alien reality that bears no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. That's astonishing because people can say, oh, it's just hallucination, but that's it's an easy, almost facile explanation because I've written about this extensively, and you can read about this in my papers, and does this explanation hold water? And I suggest that it struggles. Its mere hallucination explanation struggles because the brain learned to construct one model of the world, and it's this one. It didn't evolve to construct a bizarre hyper-technological alien reality replete with this diverse panoply of highly intelligent beings that communicate with you. That wasn't part of the script. There's no neuroscientific basis, as far as I'm concerned, or evolutionary basis for the brain's ability. I often describe this as like somebody who grew up speaking English and then at the age of 15 suddenly switched into speaking fluent Siberian Yupik or fluent Chinese or something, having never been exposed to the language or even knowing of the existence of the language, perhaps, right?
Yeah,
Imagine you suddenly start speaking one of these African click languages.
Yeah.
And like, where the fuck did you learn that? It's like, I didn't even know that language existed.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's happening, right? Your brain is suddenly starting, normally it constructs this model of reality, and it does it effortlessly, and we know how it does it, why it does it. It's perfectly well explained. And then suddenly you introduce this very, very simple alkaloid, and suddenly the brain starts constructing this extremely bizarre reality that has no relationship to it. That's astonishing.
Yeah, it's extremely complex too, from my experiences
Sure.
anyway. The more I focused at something, the more complex it became and stuff. It's pretty interesting. What are your thoughts on why DMT exists? Like it's found in a bunch of plants.
Mm.
I mean, there could be like, do plants reach this state somehow? Can they release it, you think, maybe? And maybe we're all connected to that or something? Or what's your theories? Go for
I
the
don't.
wild theories,
No,
man.
I mean, well, I mean, there are a number of levels you can answer that question. You could say at the simple biochemical level is that, well, it's a metabolic byproduct of tryptophan metabolism. Tryptophan is an amino acid, so it's one of the 21 key amino acids that are used to build proteins. So it's everywhere. So every living creature, literally, there may be some rare exceptions, but literally pretty much every living creature contains tryptophan. And tryptophan can be converted to DMT very, very easily. In fact, it takes just 2 chemical steps. So it's not surprising in a way that DMT is everywhere, and that pretty much every single plant that you look at, you will find some level of DMT. There are, of course, a few standouts that we know about and
Hmm.
that people exploit and use to obtain DMT, of course. But generally, yeah, DMT is everywhere, and that's not particularly surprising. What's astonishing is the fact that this ubiquitous molecule that you can find literally, everywhere across the world, has these remarkable effects, and unique effects as well that are not shared by any other natural psychedelic. So that's astonishing, and that to me has always said to me that DMT is special in a way. It's a bit of it's special pleading. It's a bit of a kind of a coincidence that this extremely common alkaloid would just happen to be the key to hyperspace, really. So yeah, was it embedded here? Was it embedded by some alien hyperintelligence from another universe? I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't rule it out. I
Well, you
certainly,
can't.
I'm not one
You
of the.
can't.
I can't rule it out. Exactly, you can't rule it out. I'm happy to keep one foot within the kind of the scientific paradigm, but also to reach out into areas that most scientists wouldn't dare touch, for fear of
Yeah.
being ridiculed or losing their job or something. But
Well,
it's
well,
not a
you
problem.
kind of have to with a subject like DMT because it's a subjective experience. But I mean, it's if I mean you can hear somebody say something about it, but to experience it is totally different. I mean, I did it every time. I immediately when I was done, I was like, I don't know anything. That was my whole mindset afterwards, and I was really open to there being something. And then a little bit later, it wears off, and then your rational mind comes back and you start oh, this is how reality is. It was just a never ending cycle. But you did bring up because when we're talking about entities and stuff, and this is not just me,
Mm.
there's other people too, but other substances like psilocybin, people have encountered things, especially with higher doses, um but not all the
Yeah.
time. And it seems I was discussing this with a guy in my group the other day, and it was about once you start seeing these things, right, it becomes easier to get with like mushrooms or something, right? You can
Mm.
relax a little bit, kind of do the McKenna style thing, and you can have encounters with these whatever they are, and it's not like DMT. And of course, I don't know about everybody else, but not every time I use DMT did I encounter something. But those encounters were a little bit different than psilocybin. But so isn't psilocybin like kind of just bioavailable DMT almost? I mean, it's different, obviously, but
Mm.
it's similar. I would, isn't it? Or
Yes, yes. So psilocybin is actually very, very close. It's actually the only difference between DMT and, well, I shouldn't say psilocybin, I should say psilocin. So
yeah,
psilocybin is
psilocin is a
four phosphoryloxy dimethyltryptamines. It has a big phosphate group, which
yeah.
is very quickly removed. So then you get psilocin, which is the active component, the active compound. And so psilocin is 4-hydroxy DMT. And you're right. So it has what this oxygen group creates something called a hydroxyl group, and this then forms something called a hydrogen bond with the amine, which is the nitrogen of the tryptamine part, basically. And so this this kind of wraps it up in a way and allows it to pass through the blood-brain barrier, allows it to get into the brain without being broken down. So it basically it shields it from being broken down by these MAO, these monoamine oxidases, which break down DMT very, very rapidly, and also allows it to pass and get safely into the brain, basically. So yeah, so you can think of psilocybin is kind of similar to kind of oral DMT, but you have to get very, very high doses of psilocybin to kind of reach kind of DMT level experiences, which are much easier to achieve using DMT for sure.
Yeah, and I also heard about you guys are uh doing try you do if you figured out a way to keep somebody in a constant state in the DMT land with like a drip or something,
Yeah,
or you and
yeah.
Straussman.
So yeah, so me and Rick Strassman. So
Yeah.
Strassman obviously needs no introduction. The study he did the study in the 90s, of course, and he used injection, but what's called a bolus injection, which basically means you inject somebody with the whole dose at once. Or he actually used a 30-second infusion, but basically all at once. And then they have the blood levels rise, the level of DMT rises very quickly in the brain, reaches a peak, and then comes down again quite rapidly. And so you kind of enter the DMT space. You stay there for really only like 3 or 4 minutes, and then you pop out again. And you describe the experience basically, and he, of course, recorded all of those. But what my thinking was that this kind of 4 or 5 minute sojourn within DMT space was not really long enough if we're going to actually take seriously the idea that the DMT space is a place to be explored, and that these entities are actually conscious beings that are worthy of our attention, and that we might want to actually establish some kind of stable communication with them. And I've always thought of it as a little bit rude, a bit rather impolite and uncivilized to kind of burst into their marvelous, hyperdimensional realm and then kind of to fuck off again after 5 minutes.
Certainly.
So it's not a very civilized way to conduct business, I think. So I think I'm an Englishman, so manners maketh man, and
Yeah.
that applies, in my opinion, as much in hyperspace as it does in three-dimensional space. So yeah, I wrote to Rick and I said, look, I have this idea. I have this idea of using this technology from anesthesiology, whereby you first of all you analyze the blood data of people who are given doses of DMT, so that you can measure the concentration in their blood over time, how it rises and then falls. And then you can use that to inform a mathematical model called a